Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm gonna share with you a book that I've recently read about Indigenous Australian. The book is called Stranger Country, written by Monica Tan, a Chinese Australian who has spent months in exploring Indigenous Australian culture. The reason why the author wrote her book was that she was interested in Indigenous Australian culture, so she decided to quit her job and began a road trip which ended up some 30,000 kilometers in remote and urban Australia, discovering how the life of Indigenous population have transitioned. I'm going to share with you a part of the book that talks about the exclusion of the Indigenous Australian population. The part I want to talk about is the facilitation of the Indigenous education towards the mainstream Western ones. And so the main character in this case is Unaipon, who is one of those fascinating figures from Australian history who confounds stereotypes and defies easy categorization. So what he did basically was that he advocated for a separate Aboriginal state, pushed for Aboriginal self-determination, and appeared to support the end of Aboriginal isolation and a transition into the Australian mainstream facilitated by European-style education. He had spent a lot of his later lifetime in confronting with the New South Wales government in relation to pushing for a more equal access and a more inclusive education approach for the Indigenous population. Unaipon was like the Indigenous version of Nelson Mandela, where he revolutionized the way that Indigenous students were educated. So in 1967, which was just a couple of months after he died, a national referendum ended the exclusion of Aboriginal people from the national census. This is a significant milestone for the Indigenous population of their exclusion for about 200 years since 1788, when the British colonizers were first on this land. Unaipon's action was a pretty good demonstration of the power relation that we have learned in this unit in terms of inclusion and exclusion. Some argue that power relations stand as a permanent provocation to freedom, and I strongly agree with this, because this is what the Indigenous population have suffered from for the decades, and Unaipon's action can be seen as the deliberate action of the individual on themselves that allows freedom to exist. And the constant effort that Unaipon had put in by endeavoring to turn the power relation around to end the exclusion of the Indigenous population was just like questioning and modifying those systems which make only particular kinds of action possible, which was what Ambrosio described Foucault's understanding of freedom being, and the only particular kinds of action were the rules that the British colonizers set up. Despite the fact that there have been fewer and fewer exclusions to Indigenous students, low attendance rates and absenteeism can still be often found in Indigenous students when they compare to non-Indigenous students. This is considered the aftermath of exclusion. What is also an aftermath of exclusion is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students did not respond to educators who were overtly authoritative, frequently corrected behavior, and who did not allow students autonomy over their work. This was verified during my travel on purpose from Darwin to Adelaide through Stuart Highway, the place of which Monica Tan herself heard about on iPod, while I was interviewing the indigenous people in one of the many roadhouses. Thank you very much for watching my reading share. See you next time. Bye.